Good morning, computer, and good morning to our honorable audience for Asia Insights Conference 2018. Welcome to DBS. We have a lot to share with you. It's an exciting moment for us. But ladies and gentlemen, these are at once riveting and precarious times. On the riveting end of the spectrum, we have amazing technologies which are changing and will change the way we live, the way the world works. But unfortunately, that's not the entire story. On the distressing, somewhat precarious end of the spectrum, we have old-fashioned headwinds crop up again and again. Ugly rise of nationalism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia around the world, warmongering, etc. And also, we see issues related to protectionism, which, after several decades of unfettered globalization and open markets, has become a major source of headwind and concern for us. Trade-related news and trade protectionism-related news are now being termed under the one catch-all, trade wars. Trade wars and news headlines around that are everywhere. For example, you can see headlines around the world all the time. Financial Times, New York Times, CNBC, video, audio, news, it's all consuming. And here at DBS, we spend day after day looking at downside to growth. What will happen if more goods are under tariff? What would happen to GDP outcome? What would happen to Asian currency? It's very distressing, and it's worrisome, because we have sort of built our Asian growth foundation around trade. So what I want to do is spend a few minutes trying to cut through the noise, challenge the conventional wisdom, and take you to a place which actually tells you something a little more substantive than the day-to-day discussion about US is running a deficit, and China is running a surplus, and the US is in trouble. So we begin with the basics, okay? So we are going to put up some numbers for you, starting with the basics, but then we'll challenge the basic numbers somewhat, all right? So what is the basic narrative right now? You hear it nonstop from the US side. The question all the time is that the US runs very large deficits, and it is being impoverished. The world is enjoying that as a result. And on the other end of the spectrum, the Americans constantly talk about the fact that China is running very large surpluses. It's unfair. We need fairer trade to get that down. So let's spend a few minutes looking at those so-called very large deficits. The numbers are impressively large. If you add up the last 20 years' worth of current account deficit that the US has been running, it adds up to a very large number. $9.5 trillion worth of deficits over the last 20 years. This is what keeps Donald Trump awake at night, that this cannot be acceptable. It has to change. In fact, if the US owed the world $9.5 trillion by running these deficits, every year the US would be paying a lot of money. If you even have reasonable interest rate assumption, that is something like $350 billion a year worth of payment. The US is a large economy. This is not at the end of the world, but it's a problem, especially if you are paying hundreds of billions of dollars to the world every single year because of your savings investment gap, then your currency should be under pressure, your interest rate should be under pressure. But that's not the case. We don't see a volatile dollar. We don't see spiking US interest rates. We see the opposite. Stable dollar, still a safe haven currency, and we see gradually declining US interest rates. What's going on? Maybe we should go beyond the current account numbers. Maybe this is not the whole story, and maybe Trump and his colleagues are missing the picture here. So let's go beyond current account. Let's look at the overall BOP. Is the US really paying the rest of the world $350 billion a year? Absolutely not. If you look at the latest numbers, Jan to September last year, US did not pay the world a penny on a net basis. The US received $200 billion from the rest of the world. And this is not an anomalous outcome for 2017. You can go back to 2016, 15, 14, look at the capital account side, the income account side of the US. It doesn't look like the US is an impoverished nation. It doesn't look like the US owes the rest of the world money. In fact, if you use reasonable assumption of return on investment, this would suggest instead of being owned by the rest of the world actually owes the US $5 trillion. So now we have a problem. If you focus on the current account deficit, you have a problem of massive impoverishment, indebtedness. If you go beyond that and look at the overall BOP picture, particularly on the net interest payment from the rest of the world and income payment from the rest of the world, US doesn't look bad at all. It looks actually rather strong. So $9 trillion deficit according to current account deficit numbers, or indebtedness, but $5 trillion actually implied net foreign asset positions when you look at the payment that is coming up from the rest of the world. We have a $14 trillion mystery here. What is going on? Why don't we have a proper handle on this matter? So let me try to explain this to you a little bit. I'm going to borrow a term from physics. And it's not me. Harvard professor Ricardo Hausmann came up with this first. But the economists have a fetish with physics terms. So we'll take the sexiest of all, dark matter. So in physics, dark matter is a concept without which you cannot really make sense of the universe. The way with which the galaxies are expanding, it would be far, far more if this untouchable, unfathomable product of dark matter was not taken into consideration. Similarly, in the case of the US, we have this bizarre situation where we have $14 trillion worth of untouchable assets that the US has, which is not captured in traditional BOP statistics. What's going on? So let's try to get to the bottom of the dark matter of the US. The solution is very simple. It's all around us. You consume US dark matter every single day. It's the US brands. This, ladies and gentlemen, what makes US great. The innovative, creative, world-dominating American brands that the rest of the world happily pays for every single second of the moment. American brand value is what makes America the real creditor nation, not exactly a debtor nation, as Donald Trump would like you to believe. Earlier this week, Financial Times reported a survey of the top 100 global brands in the year of the world. US brands made up 55 out of 100 out of them. If you add the brand values up of the US companies, over $3 trillion. The rest of the world doesn't even come close. So as long as the US private sector remains innovative, has investments around the world which get superior returns, US will be in pretty good shape. It can have bad behaviors of running deficits. It'll still be just fine. Now, we've talked about the US. I think I've given you some tantalizing glimpse as to what makes America really great and what is the dark matter of the US. But now let's go back to the punching boy of the moment, China. Year after year, China runs very large surpluses. What have those surpluses gotten China? Is China hugely owning the rest of the world, making lots of money from the rest of the world? Not really. What does China do with its surpluses? Invests in low-yielding US Treasury securities. And does China actually steal technology from the world? No. If you look at China's overall balance of payments data, you realize that China actually pays the rest of the world a lot of money for all those brands and all those products and services that China consumes. For instance, intellectual property. Contrary to what the American trade negotiators will tell you, China actually pays a lot of money for that. Similarly, royalties on brands. If you add up the numbers that China pays every year, it's 0.6% of GDP in royalty and interest and brand payments, $75 billion. If you look at what China makes from its investments, from all those great surpluses, it's actually not that impressive. It adds up to something like 3 to 4%. Understandable, given that China mostly invests its surpluses in US treasuries. So all those surpluses didn't really add up to much. China still doesn't have globally dominating brands like the way the US does. And China doesn't really make that much return on its investments around the world the way America's companies do. Now, I, like many of you, have been obsessed with the World Cup the last month or so. You may have noticed that you don't see too many Western brands being advertised in the World Cup right now. Watch out in the finals, you will see Hisense and Wanda and a few other fledgling Chinese brands. But these are not in the top 100 in the world. They are aspiring, they're making their presence felt. We are watching in the World Cup some of these brands, it's good. Then there are other brands in China which are becoming a part of global understanding and knowledge. Of course, Huawei and Alibaba and Tencent are very big brands. But these brands still haven't really made their presence felt in the rest of the world the way the Googles have. So they don't make that much money outside. They make a lot of money in China, they have a good brand value, but they're not quite there yet. So that, to me, is the essence of the current trade dispute. America can complain as much as it wants about the deficits. It's really not a debtor nation. It's actually a creditor nation thanks to its brands. China doesn't really have America-style brands. Its dark matters are not as big as America's dark matters. So this conference is about Asia in 2030. What do we want to see in 2030? We want to see Asia's brands becoming global brands. We want to see the Alibabas become as big as Google, if not bigger. We want Singaporean brands to become successful, world-dominating brands. And there's a lesson for all of you. Many of you here own companies, are working for developing Asian brands. The challenge for you, and hopefully some lessons from you from this conference, is to come up with ideas and innovation that will propel Asian brands forward and get us to capture our own dark matter. So the question for you, with 2030 in mind, is what will be the dark matter of your brand? That's where the essence of Asia, the future of Asia lies, in my view. So that's it from me. I've tried to shed light on the arithmetic of the trade issues. There are many other issues around the global landscape right now that need bearing. We need to watch. We need to think about where growth is going, where the population issues, the aging problem of Asia are. So there is arithmetic of trade, which I've touched upon, but then there is arithmetic of everything else. So I end here, and my colleague Tim Wong takes over.